It was a bitter night in November when David stumbled upon the lantern. He had been driving down a desolate highway in the middle of nowhere, the only lights around coming from the dim glow of his car's headlights. His destination was unclear. He had been driving for hours, the road winding through dense woods and hilly terrain, his mind clouded with frustration and exhaustion. David wasn't one for exploring the unknown, especially not at night, but something was drawing him forward. Maybe it was the loneliness of his life, or maybe it was the strange pull of a mysterious urge he couldn't quite name. Either way, something told him he wasn't going to turn back. When his headlights caught the faint outline of a shack up ahead, David instinctively slowed down. The shack, abandoned and covered with layers of moss and creeping ivy, seemed out of place. How had it been standing for so long, isolated in the heart of nowhere? And why did it look so alive? He pulled over. His headlights illuminated the small structure as he stepped out of the car. The cold air bit at his skin, sending a chill through his body. A single lantern hung outside the shack, swaying slightly in the breeze, casting an eerie yellow glow. As he approached the shack, he noticed something strange about the lantern. It wasn't flickering or dimming, as lanterns usually did in the wind. In fact, it was shining brighter with each passing second, as though it had a will of its own. It felt unnatural. Curiosity drove David closer. His mind raced with questions. Why hadn't he seen this shack before? Who could possibly live out here, so far removed from civilization? And why on earth did that lantern never go out? The closer he got, the more he felt an unsettling sensation creeping up his spine, a sense of being watched. It wasn't the lantern's glow that unsettled him the most. It was the silence around him, the silence of a world that seemed to hold its breath. When David reached the door, it creaked open on its own, as though inviting him inside. He hesitated, but something about the lantern kept him rooted to the spot, pulling him inside. Maybe it was the isolation, the mysterious glow, or maybe the feeling that something ancient was calling to him. Inside, the shack was dark except for the lantern's light, which now seemed to stretch across the room in strange, impossible ways. The shadows it cast didn't match up with the usual laws of nature. It was as though the very space around him was warped. But he couldn't look away. The lantern held his gaze. As his eyes adjusted, he saw something that made his stomach turn. In the corner of the room sat a figure, a man, or what remained of one. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, and his skin pale, almost translucent. He wore tattered clothing, his hands gripping a weathered journal. The man looked like he hadn't moved in years, but the eerie glow from the lantern seemed to animate him somehow, making him twitch and convulse in unnatural ways. David's breath caught in his throat. Was the man alive? The figure raised his head, and David could see that his mouth was moving, though no sound came out. His lips trembled as though trying to form words. David leaned closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the pull of the lantern stronger now, like it was feeding off his curiosity, drawing him closer to the center of the room. Suddenly, the man's hand shot out, gripping David's wrist with a force that made him gasp. His fingers were cold, unnaturally cold, and they dug into David's skin like the claws of some long-dead creature. David's first instinct was to pull away, But the man's grip tightened, and the world around him seemed to warp and stretch further. Don't! The man's voice was a whisper, barely audible. Don't take it. You'll never leave. David's eyes widened, and he struggled to free himself, but the man's grip remained unyielding. The lantern's light flickered for a moment, casting a dark shadow across the room. It was then that David saw it. On the far side of the room, an old wooden chest sat, its edges worn and broken with age. The chest was sealed tight, but what caught David's eye was the lantern that rested on top of it. Unlike the one in the corner, this lantern was different. It was dark, almost black in color, and it was the source of the sickly glow that filled the shack. The light seemed to pulse, as though it were alive. David's breath hitched. The man's words echoed in his mind. Don't take it. But before he could think any further, the man's voice rasped again, louder this time. It never goes out, and neither will you. A sudden wave of dizziness overtook David as the room began to spin. The lantern's glow grew brighter, filling every corner of the shack. The air thickened, pressing down on him like a heavy weight. He stumbled back, his body unable to keep up with the unnatural force pulling him towards the chest. The man's face contorted into a grotesque grin, his eyes wide with madness. It's too late now. David tried to scream, but the words wouldn't form. His body felt numb, as though it had been drained of all energy, all will to fight. He reached for the lantern, his hand trembling. The world around him shifted again, and the last thing he saw before the darkness took over was the lantern's light, forever burning, unyielding. David woke up with a start, his eyes snapping open to a scene of pure darkness. The heavy weight of the air around him pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe. His heart was pounding, and his mouth was dry. What had just happened? Where was he? He tried to move, but his body felt heavy, almost like it wasn't his own. It took a moment for his senses to fully come back, and when they did, he realized he was no longer in the shack. The familiar wooden walls and eerie glow of the lantern were gone. Instead, he was lying on cold, damp stone, his body stiff and aching. The darkness was so complete that it felt like he was surrounded by an endless void. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. He was no longer in the shack. But where was he? And why could he still hear the faint crackling sound of the lantern's flame? David forced himself to sit up, his hands scrambling against the rough stone surface. The smell of damp earth and mildew filled his nostrils, making him gag. His fingers brushed against something soft, like fabric, before his hand found a rough, metal surface. Panic surged within him. What was that? He turned, hoping to find something familiar, something that might explain where he was. Then his eyes caught a flicker of light. At first, it was just a tiny speck in the distance, like a distant star in a sea of black. But as David blinked, it grew larger, brighter, until it became unmistakable. It was the lantern, the same lantern that had been glowing in the shack, the one that never went out. But now it was different. The flame inside it danced erratically, flickering with a violent, unnatural energy. It seemed to pulse with life, like a beating heart, and somehow it was getting closer. David's blood ran cold. He scrambled to his feet, but as he did, the ground beneath him seemed to shift, the stone floor undulating like it had a mind of its own. His legs gave way, and he collapsed, his palms scraping against the floor. "Please," he whispered, his voice hoarse. He didn't know who he was begging, whether it was the lantern or whatever force had brought him here. But it didn't matter. No answer came. The lantern's light grew, and David felt himself being pulled toward it, as though it were a magnet, drawing him into its grasp. He couldn't move, couldn't escape. The closer the light got, the more disorienting the world became. The edges of his vision blurred, and the air became thick, almost suffocating. It was then that he realized something terrible. The lantern wasn't just a lantern. It was something much darker, something that had been waiting for him. "Help! Someone, please!" David cried out, but the words felt empty in the vast, oppressive darkness. There was no one to hear him. No one could hear him. He had no escape. The light was right in front of him now, and with it came a voice, a whisper, low and haunting, that slithered into his ears. "Once you take it, you'll never leave." The words were clear now, each syllable echoing in his mind, wrapping around his thoughts like a tightening noose. David's body was frozen, unable to respond, unable to break free from the force that was slowly consuming him. His mind felt like it was being torn apart, the weight of the lantern's presence crushing him. He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the lantern's metal surface. The instant his fingers made contact, a sharp, searing pain shot through his arm. It felt like his skin was being burned from the inside out. His body screamed in agony, but the pain didn't stop. It only grew stronger. And then he saw it. In the reflection of the lantern's glowing surface, he saw someone that made his blood run cold. It was the man from the shack, but he was no longer human. His face was a grotesque mask of suffering, his eyes hollow, staring straight into David's soul. The man's lips moved, but there was no sound. Yet David could feel the words in his very bones. "You shouldn't have touched it." David's chest tightened, his heart pounding as he struggled to tear his hand away. But it was impossible. The lantern held him in its grip, a dark force anchoring him to the spot. Then the room, if it could even be called a room, shifted again. The ground beneath David's feet cracked open, and a void began to form around him. Dark tendrils of smoke rose from the cracks, swirling around him, pulling him deeper into the nightmare. The man's figure faded into the shadows, his voice echoing one final time. "It never goes out, and neither will you." David felt himself falling, his body tumbling through the endless void. The lantern's light faded, but the warmth, the pull, remained, never allowing him to escape. He screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness, his cries of desperation lost in the cold, lifeless void. And somewhere in the distance, the lantern continued to burn, its light never wavering, its flame eternal. David's screams were silenced by the deep, suffocating darkness that surrounded him. His mind raced, his body felt weightless, and the world seemed to blur in every direction. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he was falling, floating, or completely still. The only thing he knew for certain was the unrelenting pull of the lantern, drawing him further into the abyss. Time had no meaning in this place. It could have been seconds or hours, days or centuries, David couldn't tell. He felt as though his very essence was being unraveled, piece by piece, consumed by the insatiable force that lurked in the shadows. Every part of him screamed to break free, to fight back, but there was nothing he could do. His body no longer obeyed him. It was as if his very will had been stolen by the lantern. The unbearable sensation of falling suddenly stopped. David felt his feet touch something solid. The ground beneath him felt cold and hard, like stone, but it didn't give him any comfort. The moment his feet landed, he was thrust into a new, horrifying reality. He blinked and found himself standing in a dimly lit room. The walls were cracked, the ceiling sagging, as though the place had been abandoned for years or longer. There was a musty, damp smell that filled the air, the kind of smell that only ancient, forgotten places could have. His chest tightened, and his heart skipped a beat. He knew this place. It was the shack he had found so many hours ago, the one with the lantern, the one that had led him here. But it was different now. The air was thick with a suffocating presence, and the walls felt as though they were closing in on him. Shadows clung to every corner, swirling like malevolent spirits. The lantern was still there, hanging in the same spot by the door, its light flickering like a heartbeat, unwavering. And there in the center of the room was the man, the one from before. His face was twisted in agony, his body contorted in ways that defied nature. He was still sitting in the same corner, but now he was surrounded by a strange, dark aura, like the very room was being consumed by his misery. His hollow eyes locked onto David's, and the man's mouth moved, forming words that David could barely hear. "It's too late for you." David recoiled. "No, please. I don't understand." The man's lips curled into a sickening grin, his teeth yellow and jagged. "You shouldn't have touched the lantern. It's already too late. You're already part of it now." David's body trembled. His hand instinctively reached up to his chest, as though expecting to find some kind of mark or scar. But there was nothing. Still, the feeling of the lantern's pull, the weight of its presence, was impossible to ignore. "Why?" David managed to choke out. "Why is this happening? What is the lantern?" The man's eyes seemed to pierce into him, seeing through him as though David wasn't even there. "It is the lantern of the lost, the ones who have wandered too far, done things they shouldn't have, and taken what wasn't theirs." David's stomach twisted as he struggled to comprehend the words. "The lost." Yes, the lantern keeps you here, in this place, with no escape. It feeds on your regrets, your guilt, and your darkest fears. Once it's claimed you, there's no going back. It will burn forever, and you will burn with it. David stumbled backward, his mind reeling. The lantern. It wasn't just an object. It was a prison for the lost souls who had crossed its path. He could feel it now, the weight of its power, pulling him in, consuming him from the inside out. It was as though every part of him was being erased, leaving only an empty shell behind. "No," he whispered, more to himself than to the man. "I won't let this happen." But the man's laughter filled the room, a low, guttural sound that made David's blood run cold. "It's already happening. You can't stop it." Suddenly, the lantern flared to life, the light blinding, casting long, sinister shadows across the room. The man's figure began to distort, his face melting, his body twisting and contorting as though it were being consumed by the lantern's flame. But the light didn't flicker or dim. It grew stronger, brighter. David covered his eyes, but it was useless. The light flooded his vision, drowning him in its unbearable glow. As the man's figure dissolved into the light, his voice echoed in David's mind, a final warning. Once you take it, you can never escape. The lantern will never go out. The world around David began to crumble. The walls shook, the floor cracked open, and the very air seemed to scream in agony. He felt his body being pulled apart, his mind unraveling, as if the lantern's curse was consuming him from within. His screams joined the cacophony of torment. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything went black. David's vision returned slowly, the darkness engulfing him completely before a faint light began to creep into his awareness. The oppressive weight in his chest was gone, replaced by a cold emptiness that seemed to stretch on forever. He tried to move, but his limbs felt stiff, like they no longer belonged to him. His body was detached from his mind, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he was even alive. Then, the lantern's light, familiar, ever burning, appeared before him. It was not in the shack, not in the room with the crumbling walls. It was in his hands. He felt its weight, a heavy, pulsing presence that anchored him to this place, to this moment. It flickered like a heartbeat, steady but unyielding. David opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came. His thoughts were like shards of glass, scattered and sharp, but unable to form into anything coherent. The lantern pulled him forward, like a tether wrapped around his soul, dragging him towards something he couldn't see but could feel. It wasn't a room. It wasn't the shack. It was a space between spaces, a place beyond the reaches of time. It was the lantern's domain. The shadows around him seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, whispering unintelligible words in a language long forgotten. The air was thick, saturated with the weight of endless regrets and lost souls, those who had touched the lantern before him and had never left. He wasn't the first, and he wouldn't be the last. The lantern's hunger was endless, its flame a curse that could never be extinguished. David could see figures moving in the shadows, faces twisted in agony, their mouths open in eternal screams. They didn't speak to him, but their presence was overwhelming, suffocating. He understood now. He wasn't meant to escape. He had become part of the lantern's eternal cycle, trapped in this place of torment for all eternity. As he looked at the lantern in his hands, he felt something shift inside him, something dark and malevolent. The lantern was no longer just an object. It was part of him now, and he was part of it. The flame inside it, though ever flickering, mirrored the beat of his own heart. It was feeding on him, just as it had fed on those before him. The guilt, the regret, the fear, it all poured into the lantern, and the lantern poured it back into him. And then, in a single horrific instant, David understood the true nature of the lantern. It was not just a lantern that never went out. It was a lantern that would never let go. The light grew, blinding him, filling his very being until he couldn't remember his name, his life, or even the pain. All that was left was the eternal flame and the darkness that would never end. Somewhere far away in the world, the lantern continued to burn forever.